Friends, not being a marathon speaker, I had negotiated with the Irvani Trust to invite another friend to share the program with me today, Dr. Ghaneh Fananapazir, who you introduced me, now I'm introducing him. He comes from a very distinguished line of Baha'i servants. His grandfather was a pioneer in Africa in those very early periods of the crusade and so on. His father's also a very deepened, grounded Baha'i teacher, and he and his brother are both very scholarly in their approaches to the cause. And I thought for this 2 days of adventure of Baha'i study, he would be a good person to invite to share the program. He's a doctor, and he lives in North Carolina with his wife and 2 children. And I'm happy that he's here. He served in the World Center when I was there and was one of the shiny Baha'i youth who continues to be shiny. Thank you.
Well, I have an impossible task. Can everyone hear me okay? On one side, I'm flanked by Mr. Dunbar's first talk, which was wonderful. And on the second part, I am all that's separating you from a lunch break. It's not entirely fair. You know, I'm very happy to be here this morning. I didn't know whether I'd be able to make it. My daughter, a few days ago, was admitted to the hospital, and it was during my vacation. So I spend most of my time as a physician in the hospital, and then on my vacation, visiting my wife's family, I spent 36 straight hours in the hospital. So fortunately, she's doing much better, and that allows me to be here. But I don't think I would have left her side had it not been for the subject of this talk, because I think it's something of utmost importance to Baha'is, especially as we're trying to gain these victories in the field, to engage as individuals in deepening our understanding of the writings of Baha'u'llah, of the Bab, of Abdul Baha, and of Shoghi Effendi. And I think one of the challenges that I was thinking about when coming up with this presentation was how, as Baha'is, do we take this challenge seriously? How, as Baha'is, do we meet the challenge of studying the writings in a systematic, fair manner in which they deserve? And it's a subject I've been thinking about a lot. As an individual who's interested in teaching, the motive of the teacher is to make sure that you instill a love for whatever the subject is in the people you are speaking with. And I've always had this challenge as a Baha'i, whether it's in the teaching field or whether it's in the deepening field, of how is it that we can allow other people to take this burden of studying the writings seriously. And it's a challenge. And I found a quote by Abdul Baha that I thought was quite useful in this regard. He says, "In the conduct of life, man is actuated." Do you know what actuated means? Anyone? Actuated? Anyone want to shout something out? Turned on. Motivated. Yes, exactly. Exactly. Good. So the word that I liked was motivated. So in the conduct of life, man is actuated or motivated by 2 main motives. This is what Abdul Baha says. There's 2 things that motivate us. One is the hope of reward, and the other is the fear of punishment. So I thought we could use this when we're looking at the topic of deepening ourselves in the writings. Now, there is an interesting compilation that came out, I think it was around the year 2000. And there was a compilation on fasting and obligatory prayer. Has anyone seen that? Familiar with that? Wonderful compilation. In it are contained a lot of pearls on the subjects of obligatory prayer and fasting that you won't find anywhere else, or at least I haven't been able to find anywhere else. One of the things, serving at the Baha'i World Center that was frustrating to me was I really wanted to say my obligatory prayer in the shrine of Baha'u'llah. Right? But then I thought to myself, wait, this is supposed to be a private prayer. So the only time that I would allow myself to say it was if there was nobody else in the shrine, which was a very rare occurrence. And then when someone came in, it was quite awkward. And the other thing was to go into that back room and hopefully no one was back there. But then again, someone might come in and again, it felt kind of awkward. And I came across this passage in there where Abdu'l-Baha says that the performance of one's obligatory prayer is not dependent upon a private spot. So I felt relieved, and then I went ahead and did it. And in fact, when you go to Haifa, there's a beautiful place to be able to say one's obligatory prayer right behind the shrine of the Bab. Okay, not the front facing, but right behind. And if you go right to the middle, you're facing directly to Bahji. But in the process of facing towards the shrine of Baha'u'llah, you are facing through that of Abdu'l-Baha and the Bab. That was my favorite place. So I felt comfortable now being able to say that. But there's this section at the end of this compilation on obligatory prayer and fasting where Baha'u'llah reveals a prayer. There's one of the longest Baha'i prayers I've seen. It's really long. And on top of that is the prayer that we're supposed to say before we break our fast at the end of the day. It's quite a challenge to say it. And in fact, one of my Nigerian roommates, when I was in Haifa, he started reading this. And I knew the first few lines, because I wanted to become familiar with it so that I knew, this was a special prayer to only say at certain times, but I heard him say it. And I remember we were just 2 minutes away from being able to break our fast. And my heart sank. And I remember he started reading it, and he turned the page, and I was not fully invested in this prayer at this moment. So I was looking and trying to see what his reaction was to this. And he saw that this prayer continued for these 2 pages. And I saw him carefully turn the next page and realize that this keeps on going on. And it goes on for about 10, 12 pages. And so he read the second paragraph, which was on the other page, and he just stopped and pretended as if that was the end of the prayer, which was fine by me. But if one does take the time to read this prayer, there's a phenomenal passage in there. Phenomenal. And this is what Baha'u'llah says in this, if you can make it through. He says, I swear by thy might, O my God, that my lamentations have halted my heart within me, and its groans have seized the reins from my hands. So it's a time when tribulations are afflicting Baha'u'llah. He says, at whatever time I reassure myself and gladden my soul with the wonders of thy mercy. So whenever I contemplate the mercy of God, he said, the tokens of thy gracious providence and the evidences of thy generosity, what happens? He says, I tremble before the manifestations of thy justice and the signs of thy wrath. So there are these 2 processes going on. There's one where we have the mercy of God, the love of God. On the other hand, we have the fear of God, the wrath of God. And then Baha'u'llah says, I recognize that thou, referring to God, that thou art known by these 2 names and described by these 2 attributes. There's 2 names, one being the merciful, one being the wrathful. So these are 2 names of God. Yet thou carest not. Thou carest not whether thou art invoked by thy name the ever-forgiving, or thy name the wrathful. God doesn't mind if he's referred to as the wrathful. It's okay. He doesn't mind if he's referred to as the ever-forgiving. That's okay. Which brings to mind another quotation. There was one of sometimes you can get the gist of what the question is that was referred to Baha'u'llah by the answer. And there is one particular passage, it's a provisional translation, where you can tell someone has referred a question to Baha'u'llah, where in the Quran it says that everything comes from God and everything returns to God. Okay? Everything comes from God, everything returns to God. And you can tell maybe the gist of this question was, what about those people that are going to hell? They're not returning to God, right? Fair question. Here's Baha'u'llah's response. He says, the beginning of all things hath ever been from God, and the return of all things shall ever be unto God. So Baha'u'llah's first statement is an affirmation of the truth of the Quranic phrase. He says, all return to the true one, though some return unto his name, the merciful, while others return unto his name, the wrathful. So I think this idea of motivation as Baha'is is something we need to think about. Sometimes we're motivated by the mercy of God. Sometimes we're motivated by the fear of God. Both of those things are legitimate ways to improve ourselves. If you have a teacher, the teacher's ultimate goal is to make sure that the student learns something. They're not so concerned whether they say, that's the most wonderful teacher I've ever had. I love that teacher. Or if they say, I did my homework because I was really scared of what would happen if I didn't. So long as the goal is achieved, God does not care whether he is known by either one of those names, so long as it leads to our progress. And it's interesting because different personalities, different individuals, tend to gravitate towards one or the other as motivations. Correct? I have a son. He's 5 years old. And when he was born, he was the easiest child ever. You told him to do something, he would do it. You told him not to do something, he wouldn't do it. And he would take it to the extreme. There was one time, I don't know what he'd done, but put him in timeout. And he sat there. I said, you have to sit on the stairs, you're in timeout. And so I went about my business and completely forgot about the fact that he was in timeout. And I think about half an hour later, I came back and I saw him sitting on the stairs. I said, what are you doing? He said, you said I was in timeout. What am I supposed to do? So that's his character. It's motivated by this idea of you tell him something, he likes these rules. So I felt pretty good about being a father until I had my second child and found out that was one of the most humbling experiences ever. My desire to write a book on being the perfect father quickly diminished into the trash can. Because my daughter responded in a completely different way. I would tell her not to do something and she would do it. I would tell her to do something, she would not do it. Completely opposite character. But the thing that she would respond to was praise. If you praised her for something, if she did something spontaneously and you praised that, she got excited by that and wanted to replicate that. And it's true too with how we view the writings. Some of us like to gravitate towards the love passages, those that have the mercy of God pervading those passages. And there are some that gravitate towards those passages that inspire fear within us. I think both of them are legitimate. And my wife and I are completely polar opposites on this. I love those passages that inspire fear. So if you get a somewhat tainted view of the importance of deepening and it scares you, this is just my particular bias. And my wife gravitates towards the other. And so when I was putting together a compilation on sacrifice, I put together the quotations that I could find and I asked my wife to read it. And I had gone through it already and circled those passages that I liked, and I asked her to go through and put check marks next to the ones that she liked. And every one that I thought was just so inspiring, she had actually X'd them out and said, don't do this one, it's too scary. And put check marks around all of the ones that I didn't do. So I think that we as Baha'is gravitate towards these two poles. And we have to understand within us what it is that motivates us, whether it's the fear, whether it's the love, or whether it's a nice combination of the two, and try and work towards that. Now, what are the requirements that one has to have to engage in deepening in the writings? I think the first thing that we have to think about is we have to have a desire, a thirst to study the writings. That's the first thing we have to do. Another thing the writings talk about is this concept of detachment, how we need to be detached from all things before we study. And the third thing that I'd like to touch upon is the importance of hard work. As Mr. Dunbar was talking about, this idea of painstakingly studying the writings. So, first of all, how do we achieve this thirst or desire to study the writings? I think the fact that we're all here is a good sign. But there are ways that are talked about in the writings to increase our desire, increase that thirst. And this is a quotation from Abdu'l-Baha. He says, "The first thing to do is to acquire a thirst for spirituality. Then live the life, live the life, live the life." So how do we acquire this thirst? He says the way to acquire this thirst is to meditate upon the future life. So the way that we understand the importance of deepening and we get that desire to really go into the writings is to meditate upon the next world. Because when we think about the next world, and Mr. Dunbar was inspiring us with this vision of what the next world is like, when we really think about our existence and we think about the next world, then all of a sudden our priorities start fitting into where they should be fitting into. Now, we have to first of all understand that the priorities which the world has are different from the priorities that Baha'i should have. Okay? Baha'u'llah has a very grim outlook on what most of the people's experience is of how they've utilized this world when they go to the next world. And he uses a very vivid analogy, which I was debating whether or not to share. What's that? Shall I? Okay. Okay. I figured since it was published, it would be okay. I won't get in too much trouble. He says, "Alas, most of the people are fast asleep." This is Baha'u'llah's view on humanity. Most of the people are fast asleep. He says, "They are even as the man who in his drunkenness," they're like a man who's drunk. This is how most of the people navigate this world. "They are even as the man who in his drunkenness became attracted to a dog." And it goes further. "Took it in his embrace and made it his plaything." Wow. Okay? This is how most of the people go through this world. "And who, when the morn of discernment dawned, and the light of the sun enveloped the horizon," so when he kind of sobered up a little bit, "he realized that the object of his affection was but a dog." And then this is the fear part. This is when they return to God, when we pass away from this world. This is the realization that the object of our affection was but a dog. He says, "Then, filled with shame and remorse, he repaired to his abode." Now, there are passages in the writings that talk about the next world, and some of them were talked about by Mr. Dunbar, about recounting the trials and tribulations that we've sustained in the path of Baha'u'llah. one of them he talks about, he says that when we get to the next world, we'll be shown the potential of what we could have achieved in this world. You can tell I like the fear of God. I like that name. Here's another passage. This is from Baha'i. He says, death is nothing more than ascending from one world to another world more subtle than the first. It is being transferred from one state of existence to another. The detached among my servants look forward to this state and beseech God, glorified be his glory, to attain it. For after that soul ascendeth, it shall circle around God and enjoy his presence. So when we depart from this world, we get to attain the presence of God. Very nice, right? But then, it says, after which it will return towards the station in which it deserves. So this concept that we will have this blissful experience, and then we will be returned to the station that we're supposed to have. And Baha'i says that we should always keep in mind our mortality. Always keep in mind the fact that we come from God and we return to him. He says, know thou that every hearing ear, if kept pure and undefiled, must at all times and from every direction hearken to the voice that uttereth these words, verily we are God's, and to him shall we return. He says, this is from Baha'i, a newly translated passage. He says, peruse my verses with joy and radiance. Verily they will attract you unto God and will enable you to detach yourselves from all else save him. Thus have you been admonished in God's holy writ and in this resplendent tablet. Then Abdu'l-Baha says, may your souls be illumined by the light of the words of God. And may you become repositories of the mysteries of God. For no comfort is greater and no happiness is sweeter than spiritual comprehension of the divine teachings. Repeat that. No happiness is sweeter than spiritual comprehension of the divine teachings. Then he says, if a man understands the real meaning of a poet's verses, such as those of Shakespeare, he is pleased and rejoiced. How much greater his joy and pleasure when he perceives the reality of the Holy Scriptures and becomes informed of the mysteries of the kingdom. So that's the first aspect, is understanding this perspective, that this world is limited, that we have a limited time to be able to understand Baha'u'llah's writings while being on this planet, and we need to try and prioritize our life in that regard. The second requirement that I mentioned was that idea of detachment. And I don't want to get into that right now because I want to get into it a little bit later. But this is a very, very important aspect of it. And then the third aspect of studying the writings is this idea of hard work. This is the part that most people have trouble with, including myself. And there was one time when I was having a class on the Kitab-i-Ghan, and I had a group of 14, 15-year-olds in this class. And we were supposed to start on Sunday, and I got a frantic call Saturday from one of the 3 students I had in the class. And he said, Ghaneh, is there any way we can postpone it till next week? I said, okay, what's going on? He said, I have an exam. I said, no problem. We'll have it next week. So we had it the following week. But I made him pay for it. So we sat there in class, and I turned to him. I said, why is it that you needed to postpone this date? He said, well, I had a test. I had an exam on Monday, and I really needed to study for it. And I said, didn't you attend? Did you miss some of the teacher's classes? And he said, no. I went to all the classes. I went to every single one of them. I said, were you asleep during the classes? He said, no, I was wide awake. I said, well, why did you need to study for this test? Haven't you heard it at all at some point in time? He said, yes, but you can't just listen to it. You have to actually go down and sit down and actually go through it and try and memorize things and, do some work on it and try and understand it for yourself. I said, okay, that's fair. And then I said to him, how did you do on the test? He said, I got an A. I said, that's excellent. Very, very good. I said, what would happen if I gave you that same exact test in a month's time? He said, I would fail it. I said, why would you fail it? You went to all the classes, you studied it, you learned it. He said, well, you have to keep on going at it. You can't just study it once and then think you're done with it. You have to continually study it. He was falling into the trap. And I said to him, be honest with yourself. Do you think studying the Baha'i writings is any different in that regard? And he thought about it and he said, no. I said, so how are we going to implement this? He said, I will do my homework, I will listen, he said, and I will be constant about doing it. And he was. He was very, very good. So I think one of the things is we tend to, as individuals, take our scholastic studying quite seriously, but our Baha'i studying plays second fiddle. And I think if we have this perspective of the next world, we'll try and switch the orientation. Hopefully we can do both, but if we have to pick one, hopefully we know which one that is to pick. And when the writings talk about this, they use this term earnestly. What does earnestly mean? There's some people Googling that definition right now on their iPhones. Sincerity. That was a good Google search, very quick. With sincerity, yes. With eagerness, huh? With zeal, with purpose.
From the heart.
From the heart. I like these ones. So think about these when we read these passages. What's that?
Like Ernest would do it.
Exactly. That's a different definition. Don't know if that was intended. Abdul-Baha says, I counsel you that you study earnestly the teachings of Baha'u'llah. Then another passage. And it's interesting. A lot of the passages that talk about earnest studying or painstaking study is directed towards the youth. That doesn't mean us adults are absolved from that, but it's very important for youth to be involved in this. There's a tradition in Islam that says that when we get to the next world, we'll be asked 4 questions. I'll tell you one of them. One of them is, how did you spend your youth? That's 25% of our final exam. How did we spend our youth? Some of it's a little late. We either passed or failed. But for those of us who have chance, it's good to think about that. So Shoghi Effendi says, on his behalf, if the younger Baha'i generation, in whom Shoghi Effendi has great hopes, take the pain of studying the cause deeply and thoroughly, read its history, find its underlying principles, and become both well-informed and energetic, they surely can achieve a great deal. It is upon their shoulders that the Master has laid the tremendous work of teaching. They are the ones to raise the call of the kingdom and arouse the people from slumber. If they fail, meaning the youth, the cause is doomed to stagnation. All of that centered around making sure that the youth takes the pain of studying the writings. The other thing that's interesting is this idea of memorization. I just wanted to touch upon. On his behalf, Shoghi Effendi says, the Master used to attach more importance to the learning by heart of the tablets of Baha'u'llah and the Bab. During his days, it was a usual work of the children of the household to learn tablets by heart. Not little itty-bitty quotations. Tablets. As a society, we tend to do things in the reverse, and I'm equally guilty of that. Our biggest meal of the day is usually dinner. what use is that? We're just going to be sleeping and has no use. Our body has no use for such a large meal in the evening time. And our smallest meal tends to be breakfast, correct? Is that fair to say as a society? When we really need that energy for the whole day. So we tend to reverse things. And I think we do the same thing with our children. I think we tend to, when they're small children, we think, oh, small children, small quotation. Small prayer. Oh, God, guide me. That's good. Very good. And then they say the prayer at feast, oh, God, guide me. Very good. And then they turn 10 years old and they're asked to say a prayer, oh, God, guide me. And then they're 20 years old and they ask to say a prayer, oh, God, guide me. Children have incredible capacity to be able to memorize that we don't necessarily tap into. There was an interesting documentary on HBO that highlighted children from around the world who had memorized the Quran. And Arabic, for most of them, was not their native language. They didn't even know what it was, but they had memorized the entire Quran. And they would come once a year to Cairo, to Egypt, for a Quranic memorization competition. And they were tested. As Baha'is, I think it would be nice to be able to challenge our children to be able to try and memorize, as Abdul Baha did, whole tablets of Baha'u'llah. Imagine the sense of achievement in the child when they're able to recite it. Why not encourage a child to memorize the Kitab-i-Ghan? Is it beyond their capacity? No. The Kitab-i-Ghan is smaller than the Quran. It's completely within their capacity. That's something to think about. An effort should be made, Shoghi Effendi says, to raise the standard of studies so as to provide the Baha'i student with a thorough knowledge of the cause that would enable him to expound it befittingly to the educated public. So this concept of raising our standard. Now, as Baha'is, we have a duty to read the writings. Is that correct? Found where? Where is that duty found? Kitab-i-Aqdas. Very good. He says, recite ye the verses every morn and eventide. Here's the commandment. Here's the fear that he instills into this commandment. Whoso faileth to recite them hath not been faithful to the covenant of God and his testament. And whoso turneth away from these holy verses in this day is of those who throughout eternity have turned away from God. And then he says, fear ye God, O my servants, one and all. Pride not yourselves on much reading of the verses or on a multitude of pious acts by night and day. So it's not the quantity that's important. For were a man to read a single verse with joy and radiance, it would be better for him than to read with lassitude. What's lassitude? Laziness. Okay. Than lassitude all the holy books of God, the help and peril of the self-subsisting. So this concept is that it's the quality of our reading that's much more important than the quantity. Read ye the sacred verses in such measure that ye be not overcome by languor and despondency. Lay not on your souls that which would weary them and weigh them down, but rather what will lighten and uplift them. So this process of deepening, this process of going into the Word of God is supposed to be something that inspires us, something that motivates us. And I think sometimes one can take from this passage the wrong message. It's not saying don't read a lot and just read a small amount. It's saying make sure that when we say something, it affects our soul. And that usually takes time, right? I mean, usually, we've got a day-to-day life, we've got a busy schedule, we wake up right away and we quickly turn on the iPhone and see if we got any emails or texts overnight. We go through this process and then we have to say our morning passage. And I think the point is that we need to take some time to be able to develop that spiritual attitude towards realizing that potential within those words themselves. Have most people been on pilgrimage? Most people, yes. Seeing a lot of nods. Some people no. The path to the shrine of the Bab, or to the shrine of Baha'u'llah, is a very difficult path to walk on. It's made out of crushed tiles. Seen that? Have you ever tried to walk fast on that path? Very difficult. And deliberately so. Because that process of slowly walking through the gardens and not going straight into the shrine of the Bab is how we develop, and allowing the surroundings to sink in and to think about where we're going. We're going to go into the presence of the Bab or the presence of Baha'u'llah. That process of going there requires some time to be able to detach ourselves from the things of this world. There's a process involved. So they make the tiles all crushed and difficult to walk on. It forces us to slow our pace down and think about this before we go into the presence of God. Correct? The same process is something that should animate how we study the writings in the morning and the evening. It's this process of slowing down, allowing us to realize what we're reading, think about it, think about the fact that when we read these words, we're being put in touch with Baha'u'llah. It's a process. Baha'u'llah says, "Peruse ye every day the verses revealed by God. Blessed is the man who reciteth them and reflecteth upon them." Blessed. He truly is of them whom it shall be well. It's good to be in that category. So, one of the ways that Baha'u'llah describes his revelation is that of an ocean. Baha'u'llah says, "Immerse yourselves in the ocean of my words, that ye may unravel its secrets and discover all the pearls of wisdom that lie hid in its depths." So the Word of God is likened to an ocean. Okay? And this is a beautiful analogy because the Word of God itself is likened to water. Correct? You can see that in the Bible, you can see that in the Quran, this analogy of the Word of God being water. The vast quantity of this water that we have in this day is why it's referred to as an ocean. And Baha'u'llah, in one of his tablets in fact, his most holy tablet, the tablet to the Christians, talks about the most great ocean is attached to the River Jordan. The River of Jordan, being the revelation of Christ, is attached to this most great ocean. You can't take one drop out of it and say this is water from the ocean and this is from the water of the River Jordan. In reality, the water is the same, both water. So they're attached, they're linked. The difference is that at one time it was a river, now we have an ocean to deal with. And so here's a happy passage for those that like the happy ones. "My servants," Baha'u'llah says, "my holy, my divinely ordained revelation can be likened unto an ocean, in whose depths are concealed innumerable pearls," innumerable, "pearls of great price, of surpassing luster. It is the duty of every seeker to bestir himself." Bestir means what? Exactly. Get up and go. Move. To bestir himself and strive to attain the shores of this ocean, so that he may, and this is the part that I want you to listen to, so that he may, in proportion to the eagerness of his search, in proportion to the eagerness of his search and the efforts he hath exerted, partake of such benefits as have been preordained in God's irrevocable and hidden tablets. So the amount of pearls that we're able to gather from this ocean is not necessarily dependent upon our capacity, but much more so on how much eagerness we meet this challenge. So that's the happy one, which means there's a fearful one coming. my servants, Baha'i says, through the might and power of God, and out of the treasury of his knowledge and wisdom, I have brought forth and revealed unto you pearls that lay concealed in the depths of his everlasting ocean. He said, I have summoned the maids of heaven. This is a Quranic reference. This idea of 70 virgins that are awaiting us in the next world, if we're into that. But he reinterprets it. He said, I have summoned the maids of heaven to emerge from behind the veil of concealment and have clothed them with these words of mine, words of consummate power and wisdom. Bahá'u'lláh says that the meaning behind these maidens of heaven is the meanings behind the words of God. I think some people who are expecting otherwise will be in for a rude awakening in the next world when they find this out. And he says, I have, moreover, with the hand of divine power, unsealed the choice wine of my revelation, and have wafted its holy, its hidden and musk-laden fragrance upon all created things. Then he says, who else but yourselves is to be blamed if ye choose to remain unendowed with so great an outpouring of God's transcendent and all-encompassing grace, with so bright a revelation of his resplendent mercy. So who else but us is to be blamed if we do not dive into this ocean and start gathering these pearls from it? And it's interesting, in the book of Revelation, it says that heaven, the entrance to heaven, is bounded by gates. And those are called the pearly gates. Have you heard that phrase before? Pearly gates. So the entrance to heaven is made out of these pearls. Now the pearls themselves are the meanings that we gain from it. So it's through understanding these meanings that allows us to enter into heaven. Remember Abdu'l-Baha's statement that no greater pleasure is better than understanding the words of God. This is heaven, when we're able to dive into this ocean and get new inspiration and new insights. And the gates of that heaven are the meanings, the pearls. And in the Bible, we see the same analogy. We read about this pearl of great price. He says, again, the kingdom of heaven is like unto a treasure hid in a field. Okay? It's like this kingdom of heaven, this inner meaning, this heaven, is like a treasure that's buried inside a field. The which, when a man hath found, so when someone comes across it, he hideth it, he puts it back in the ground. And for joy thereof, goeth and selleth all that he hath, and buyeth that field. It's this process that when we understand the import of what it is that we actually have, how beautiful these meanings are that we can unravel from the Word of God, we sell everything that we have. We prioritize our life so that we're able to partake of these pearls. He says, again, the kingdom of heaven is like unto a merchantman, seeking goodly pearls, who, when he had found that one pearl of great price, went and sold all that he had and bought it. This is our attitude that the Bible encourages us to use when we're dealing with the Word of God. So what are the reasons that prevent us from studying the writings as seriously as we're supposed to? What are the stumbling blocks? Anyone? Excuses. They're all excuses. What kinds of excuses do we make? Too busy. Anything else? Huh? Fear? Apathy? Interruption? What's that? Sense of superiority. Wow, we've got a lot more than I could think of. This is great. This is great. Okay. So one of the things that was brought up is this idea of not enough time. Mr. Dunbar talked about this. And this is the famous passage from The Advent of Divine Justice that deals with a chaste and holy life. A passage that most Baha'i youth are quite familiar with. It says, such a chaste and holy life, with its implications of modesty, purity, temperance, decency, and clean-mindedness, involve no less than the exercise of moderation in all that pertains to dress, language, amusements, and all artistic and literary avocations. It demands daily vigilance in the control of one's carnal desires and corrupt inclinations. And then this is the passage that I think is quite interesting. He says, it calls for the abandonment of a frivolous conduct with its excessive attachment to trivial and often misdirected pleasures. So this is interesting. It calls for because we're talking about a chaste and holy life, how to lead a holy life. One of the things is it calls for the abandonment of this frivolous conduct with its excessive attachment to trivial and often misdirected pleasures. And in a letter written on behalf of the House of Justice, they talked about this statement. It says, the beloved guardian is describing the requirements not only of chastity, but of a chaste and holy life. Both the adjectives are important. One of the signs of a decadent society, which we're living in, a sign which is very evident in the world today, is an almost frenetic devotion to pleasure and diversion. These are the things Mr. Dunbar was alluding to. This frenetic devotion to pleasure and diversion. We always try and keep ourselves busy with something or another. An insatiable thirst for amusement. Right? Think about the amount of TV shows or movies that we watch. This is something I'm guilty of. A fanatical devotion to games and sport. Whole channels devoted to following sports. How much time do we spend following the Washington Redskins? So these are things that we have to think about. Now, understanding in the same token that just because these things are there, it doesn't mean we shouldn't enjoy them. But it says an excessive devotion to these things. Excessive. And I was trying to think about, well, what does excessive mean? And I think excessive means if it prevents us from doing the things we're supposed to be doing. Okay? If we have everything lined up and we're doing our studying of the writings and taking it seriously, and we're saying our prayers and we're involved in Baha'i community activities and so forth, fine. Sit down for a couple of hours on a Sunday and watch a game. And watch the Redskins beat Dallas. But if, on the other hand, we find ourselves not having fulfilled our checklist of responsibilities as Baha'is, and we still are involved in these things, it's something to think about, whether our priorities are really lined up with where they should be. And there was a nice passage. I was reading some of the traditions attributed to Muhammad, and I came across this interesting one, which I couldn't find the exact passage, but I know that there's a part in the Guardian's writings where this is mentioned. But this idea that rest is supposed to be for a purpose. You know? In American society, rest is supposed to be the goal. Correct? We work hard so that we can retire. Okay? That's the goal in life. We work hard Monday through Friday so that we can enjoy ourselves on the weekend. And the Baha'i faith has a different viewpoint on this. This is from one of the traditions in Islam. It says, everything one achieves is a result of a strong desire. You have to have a desire to achieve something, a wish to bring that about, a choice to actually do it, and an effort, that painstaking studying of the writings. And Muhammad says, and at the end, one needs to relax. It's good to relax. Watch the Redskins beat the Eagles. It's okay. But then it says, if the relaxation is to gather strength to do yet another thing, after having done a thing following my path, then that person has found salvation. So if recuperating by watching the Redskins destroy Dallas is, I hope there are no Dallas Cowboys fans in here. Sorry, I apologize. If it's to enable us to relax so that we can do more things, that is a blessed action. He said, but if he is resting for any other reason, he will be lost. So it's good to relax, but we relax for a purpose. Now, another interesting thing I found in the course of looking at these quotations was something that changed my view of what I had thought before. And I like those passages. I mean, finding those passages that destroy one's previous notions, I think, are what allows one to grow as a Baha'i. Right? They allow us to change our vision so we see things a little better. And I found 5 quotations on the same subject, so I think it's pretty valid. And this is how Baha'is should approach the problem of studying the writings while at the same time the responsibilities of school or work. And I always had the notion that, okay, come final exam time, work is worship, and my studying for my final exam in calculus is much more important than studying the writings. So I will prioritize it right now to study for my exam, and then after my exam is done, I will go back to studying the writings. And my notion was dashed. When someone wrote to the Guardian to ask what kind of career they should pick, he wrote, regarding your question concerning your studies, as this is purely a personal matter that concerns your own future, the Guardian feels that you should decide it yourself in consultation with your parents. He urges you, however, to devote yourself as much as possible to studying and spreading the Baha'i teachings, whatever your other occupation may be. So, not so concerned with what particular profession you choose and which one you want to study, but he reorients us to say, what I do care about is making sure that you study the writings. The Guardian hopes that whatever other studies you take up, you will continually study the teachings and endeavor to acquire a profound knowledge of them. The importance of young Baha'is becoming thoroughly steeped in every branch of the teachings cannot be overemphasized, as they have great teaching tasks ahead of them to accomplish. So I think one of the things that we understand now is that this idea of not enough time is really a question of what are our priorities. I think one of the other things that can be difficult in studying the writings is that it can be overwhelming. Is that not true? Right? We look at this vast ocean and we say, wow, how can I even begin? It's so vast. In fact, in the writings it says that the number of meanings is without limit. He says there is no limit, this is from Shoghi Effendi, there is no limit to the study of the cause. No limit whatsoever. And touching upon what Mr. Dunbar had mentioned, this passage in the writings of the Bab, I just wanted to reiterate it because I thought it's a very beautiful concept. This idea that every word, every letter of the Word of God, the Bab says, has the number of meanings equal to the number of atoms in the universe. Wow. How many atoms are in the universe? So I looked it up. I was curious. I'm paraphrasing it, so it's not a direct quote. I'll repeat the paraphrase. The Bab states that the number of meanings in one letter of the Word of God, it's a single letter, is equal to the number of atoms in the universe. Now I looked it up, and with the caveat that this is the known universe so far, Mr. Dunbar was talking about how we're realizing this more beyond. There's 3 times 10 to the 80. Okay? Now that means that it's 3 times 10 with 80 zeros at the end of it. Okay? And then, as Mr. Dunbar was saying, the Bab says that's only the number of obvious meanings. says, for every obvious meaning, there's a hidden meaning. And we have to multiply it by 2. See, we're getting a nice equation here. And then he says, for every hidden meaning, there is a concealed meaning. And for every concealed meaning, there is a hidden concealed meaning, etc. So in reality, the amount that we can get out of one letter is infinite. Let alone the fact that we have 100 volumes of Baha'u'llah's writings, 100 volumes of Abdul-Baha's writings, tens of volumes of the Bab's writings, 100 volumes of Shoghi Effendi's writings, the messages from the House of Justice, the history of the cause. It's overwhelming. And that's okay. Abdul-Baha quotes a tradition from Islam, just to give us the sense of nothingness. He said, God, exalted is He, fashioned 100,000 lamps. So God created 100,000 lamps. I think it's 100 million. Is that correct? 100 million lamps. So picture that. 100 million lamps. He suspended the throne, the earth, the heavens, and whatever is between them, even heaven and hell. All of the known universe, everything, even heaven and hell. He said all of these are in one lamp. Only God knoweth what is in the rest of the lamps. So this is just something that inspires a sense of we can never achieve it. But I think the point is that we have to make a start. Okay? And I think it's more difficult for Baha'is. You know, there was a study that was done that was called the JAM study. Has anyone heard of that? The JAM study? It's revolutionary within circles of science where they care about these things. But this was a study where they had a grocery store. And they had 26 varieties of jam laid out for people to test. Does anyone do that? Go to grocery stores to test the food, and you usually get a pretty decent meal out of it. So this is one where they had 26 jam containers out there. And people could go and try them. And they did. And they were all given a $3 coupon, and that was that. 2 hours later, they took down the 26 jams, and they only left 6 jams up there. And they let people try 6 jams. And they gave people the $3 coupon, and that was that. And then 2 hours later, they put 26 up there, and then 2 hours later, they put back the 6. Now, when people were asked about it, they all preferred, the majority of people preferred having the variety. They liked the idea of having 26 jams out there. Looks good. When it came down to it, 3% of the people who had the 26 jams available bought one of the jams. 3%. When people only had 6 varieties available to them, 30% of them bought one. Now this is revolutionary, because you would think you have more variety, therefore people will buy more things. But as we see in our grocery stores today, when we're trying to buy cereal and we've got huge aisles of it, it can be intimidating. Or I take my son to an ice cream shop, and he's got all these flavors to choose from, and he can only pick one. He just stands there and just kind of stares and looks back and forth. I said, pick one. He becomes paralyzed. And I think this is true of the writings. We have such a variety of writings that are out there, it becomes very difficult for us as Baha'is to make that leap and just grab one of them and just start purchasing it and using it and making it a part of our lives. So I think one of the things that is a bounty that Shoghi Effendi does is he actually picks a few things from this range of writings. He picks a few choice writings that he says that we as Baha'is have to study. So he takes this volume and just narrows it down to a few that is vitally important. And we'll get down to that in the next class or so. Thank you. Enjoy your lunch.